What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. Cannot wait to not have someone talking at me about the November 2024 election. Unfortunately, Jeremy and I are about to do just that to you. So apologies in advance. Jeremy Mack from the Phoenix Project, which is the organization that launched earlier this year specifically to track dark money in local politics. He and I nerd out about a few Bay Area specific techno-fascistic characters and their plans for the future. These are people who have so much money and you wish that they would just buy their fourth house with it, but instead they're spending it on trying to control the rest of us. We're gonna talk about TogetherSF, one of the local dark money astroturf groups. We're also gonna talk about one of their local propositions on the ballot, Prop D, a ballot measure to give more power to the mayor of San Francisco in what is already a quote unquote strong mayor system of government here. That's the political science term. Some of the stuff I would put under the category of boring but important. But the reason that it is important is these are policies that are being used to mess with our lives. And if there's one takeaway from this episode, because this is an episode full of names of political consultants, of tangents, it's an episode of skirmishes between centrists and progressives in local elections. Jeremy even drops some city charter amendment dates in here. But if there's one takeaway, it's that there are two kinds of people in the world of politics. People who want to concentrate power among a few people and others who want to spread it out. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people around who want to do that first one. I think I need to set up this episode with a little information about one of these creeps. He is the anti-woke warrior, Balaji Srinivasan. He is a crypto bro who wants to replace San Francisco with a segregated tech city. Specifically, he's floated taking Alamo Square, the Lower Haight and Hayes Valley, and walling it off as part of the network state. He has a whole manifesto called the network state. It's basically late 90s video games come to life, dividing people up into clear caste systems split between red, blue, and a new emerging gray tribe. Red for Republican, blue for Democrat, and gray is people like Balaji Srinivasan, tech bros who are at the top of society, and they're going to live in gray-only zones with a gray-controlled police force, according to his plan. I know it all sounds like a dumb pitch for a bad spin-off of a video game that I spent the most time playing as a kid, SimCity. The only thing is that Balaji has a lot of money and has been sucking up to and has the ear of more influential tech bros like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, and Elon Musk. Jeremy and I recorded this live at my place, so thank you to Tofu. Extra thanks to Tofu for making it slightly more listenable. And a trigger warning because we do speak about sexual assault briefly. Unfortunately, people who want to concentrate power seem to have a problem with the concept of consent. If you find this episode useful or interesting, go to patreon.com/San Francisco. You can donate to keep the project going. Thank you to Ara Lily and Leslie. What's up, Leslie? For becoming members. For $5 or more, you're supporting the project. You get monthly bonus behind the scenes episodes. And here is Jeremy.
And that's how TogetherSF, in their leaked document, that's how they brand themselves. Like they're
so let's talk about the leaked documents that came to you.
Yep.
Anonymous source.
Yep.
Phoenix Project, which, as we know, dedicated to exposing dark money in politics. Mm-hmm. Somebody comes to you with TogetherSF, sort of like mini manifesto, sort of a business plan.
Yeah, that reveals $17 million of dark money that then is brought to light.
Right.
It's kind of like a little Project 2025 in some ways. Not to overuse that term, But it basically laid out.
I think it's good shorthand. Like, people know what that means.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's just the fact that they said, here is our plan to take over San Francisco. To do so through these means, and one of them being to sow, continued community dissatisfaction as a way to get people to vote for their agenda.
Right. Yeah. Like, specifically, like one of the big quotes from this plan is to, quote, grow and sustain a movement of community dissatisfaction is the point of TogetherSF.
So it's one of their goals. Yeah. Because they want to use
it's kind of a tactic.
It's a tactic, it's a strategy to get people to show up and vote for their candidates, to vote for their issues.
Right. Like,
and so it's basically like they run on a culture war. So when you talked about like the Fentanyl ads, it's like they're trying to sow that anger. They're trying to, like, they're using the doom loop. And advertising the doom loop, which we know, TogetherSF and TogetherSF and Neighbors for a Better San Francisco are very interconnected. Neighbors for a Better San Francisco paid $200,000 in just 2022 alone to media and to videographers to help push the doom loop forward. People like Susan Dyer Reynolds in Gotham by the Bay Media, Philly Roberts, who does like kind of like gotcha crime videos, and then use that information to push to Epoch Times, like a far right Fanlun backed media organization that Gary Tan loved, or pushing it to Fox News.
Doom loop kind of idea, like that was an AstroTurf thing that became real to people. Like it became like stories in the New York Times and became like a thing that people talked about on podcasts. Like I think like even Joe Rogan did like a thing, like an episode after the Doom loop was conceived about like why San Francisco sucks, basically.
Yeah, and that's the culture war. It's like, why is critical race theory a problem? Because a bunch of right-wing folks made it into a problem.
Right.
It wasn't an issue that we talked about 5 years ago.
No. Yeah,
but then they found an issue that they planted and said, this is now going to be our culture war issue.
Right.
And then pushed it forward and made it into an
Totally. Yeah. Same with shoplifting. That was very handy when the cops were coming around looking for more money for their purposes. These little narratives you put out there in cases like the critical race theory scare, it feels like that has a lot less currency than it used to 3 years ago. Right. So it's like waves. And they're looking,
run with it.
They're looking for the next doom loop now. I don't know what it's going to be, but
that's a good question. That's actually the $1 million question right now, for me at least. Is like, now that the doom loop in many ways, and like Mark Farrell, Marjan Philhauer, Trevor Chandler, Bilal Mahmood, and even more so, I would say Adam Lujan, have all kind of made their bread and butter off of running on this fear of the doom loop.
Yeah,
which is, I would say, more of a culture war. Once again, kind of a narrative. They weren't necessarily running on a policy platform, but they're running on fear.
Right.
A fear tactic, which is a very classic right-wing strategy.
For sure.
They're like, we don't have to have solutions besides like, elect me, I'm tough on crime. I'll be a superhero and solve all your problems. Yeah, so like they have been pushing forward this doom loop narrative, which now that the city is like, it's shown objectively that like crime rates have been dropping. People don't feel as unsafe maybe as they once did. Also, and to tie in, like kind of coming out of things with the worst economic impacts of the pandemic. And also the media narratives changed.
Yeah.
Once Chesa Boudin gets recalled, we don't have to talk so much about crime.
Right.
All of a sudden, it's not like every time like a store gets robbed, it's like, oh, thanks, Chesa.
Right.
It's like Brooke Jenkins comes in, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, it's not Brooke's fault that there's a...
Right, yeah, they need to like pass the blame somewhere else.
Right,
yeah,
to a different issue.
Yeah.
And so I think that like it's just another example of the way in which we see the media pushing narratives that then informs people's realities.
Right.
And I think people right now in San Francisco are kind of showing like actually like they're not quite so afraid in the way that they were in 2022, in 2023, where they were really hyping this up. But they're trying to get as much mileage out of this as possible.
Yeah.
And we'll see how it looks with this November, if there is enough mileage to get them over the hump here in November, which has brought them through their successes in 2022, brought them through their successes in 2023, brought them through their success in March. But can they make it to the finish line?
the leaked documents. We're going to talk about the money a little bit later. But was there anything else that stuck out to you that you think
from those documents
might be of interest? Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to get a sense for like what is this organization?
Yeah. What's most important about it? I mean, I think that like we're still trying to figure out like the intricate, like the ways in which like neighbors grow in together, like play nice versus like where their splits are. And that's something that I really spent a lot of time like thinking about and looking into. I think that the money was pretty huge, that being really revealing that like Michael Moritz has put so much. And actually, you know, with him pledging the $17 million, he's buying away the biggest funder of San Francisco politics in like the history of the city.
Yeah.
You know, like it puts him into a whole other tier of big spender. I think that's pretty important. And it was a big revelation within it. Like I said, like the longer term strategy of being like, yeah, like they're not going anywhere. They're like, they have this shit mapped out till 2028.
Right.
And they're thinking about from top to bottom. They've mentioned, you know, from mayor all the way down to community college board, like how to get all of their people in those positions of power. And that's exactly what they're doing, you know, is getting those people into power. And it really emphasized how they truly are acting like a pack. You know, they truly are a political juggernaut in a way, like it should trip a couple of city laws and ethics laws around, but they just maybe haven't gotten caught yet.
Yeah, I mean, that is another issue. Like, I think we'll talk more about the money as the episode goes on.
Another thing about property that I want to mention that's important is that actually it carries forward a long-standing historical back and forth. And I think this is something that's really important for a lot of people who are either connected or not connected to San Francisco politics and politics generally, is that like a lot of times people's memories don't go back very far.
Sure.
It's like, what's happened the last 10 years is everything that's important. And like if it happened more than 15, 30, 40 years ago, it's not relevant anymore. But to show that like we've had a long history of back and forth with charter amendments, going back to 1900 charter amendment, then the 1936 charter amendment, and then all over to 1976. 1934 charter amendment and the 1976.
These are
and then
dates I did not
96, you know, moving up 96 moving up to the present. And it's always been a back and forth between basically like the more progressive people who are like more neighborhood activists, grassroots neighborhood activists, and the downtown. And it's always been this battle back and forth between who gets to guide the ship, who gets to run the city. And TogetherSF is showing up as a player to push things back towards downtown runs the city.
Right.
The billionaires run the city. The corporations run the city. And you all just have to acquiesce through a democratic process, you know, give us a thumbs up to allow us to continue to have the consent that they need to further push the city in a direction that their billionaire backers would wish to see shaped. So for people like William Obendorf, Neighbors for Better San Francisco, who's one of the biggest donors to Prop D. He's given over $500,000 to the Prop D fund. Michael Moritz himself, beyond the money he's given to TogetherSF, he's also personally given $2.5 million to the Prop D fund. So he just keeps going. He just, you know.
I mean, with Obendorf, like, dude is really old. And I know these tech billionaires like are like convinced that they're going to be able to like live to 150.
Yeah.
But I'm like, you are planning for a future that I really don't even know if you're going to see. They're interested in control beyond their like natural lives, I guess.
Right. Well, in Obendorf specifically, like Neighbors for Better San Francisco, almost half of their board members between their C3 and their C4 are like national charter school advocates. And William Obendorf himself is the co-founder of Betsy DeVos, he and Betsy DeVos's American Federation for Children, which is a national charter school advocacy organization. But like they see ground zeros happening here. And lo and behold, we have a bunch of school closures that are coming up. First time in how many decades?
Yeah.
And that's part of the national script. I mean, look at Chicago. Like the charter schools happen through closing the schools. You create the need for charter schools to come in. And then you push the charter schools in and say, look, this is how we're solving the problem that they themselves created.
Right. The dissatisfaction.
Exactly. That they themselves stood. Exactly. Yeah. So like that is made all the more possible when you have a stranglehold over for City Hall. Deregulation, and especially for the real estate corporations and real estate moguls, deregulation to help both roll back environmental protections, but also zoning laws that will radically increase the price of land in San Francisco. All of a sudden, if you can build an extra 10 stories on a property, that property is now worth exponentially more because you can now build higher on it and make more profit up from it. So like finding new ways to further extract money from the city, and ways to just, and as doing such, like continue to line these people's pockets and make the city into a city that's even more tech friendly and tech, beaconing than it was in the height of Ed.
Yeah, well, I mean, forever, or California forever is like on hold. They got to like turn back to Silicon Valley, I guess.
Right, and it's on all fronts. It's
that's true.
It's on all fronts.
Yeah, they're gonna keep trying to push California forever.
Yeah, right.
One thing that I recently read talking about how like these people are creeps.
Yeah.
Reading about how people like Elon Musk, these like tech billionaires, Peter Thiel, they are hiring lawyers to try to create wills and create legacy documentation of like, should their bodies ever be revived from like being cryogenically frozen at the time of their death, that all of the wealth that they've accumulated will be in place for them when they're unfrozen. These people want to keep their wealth for millennia.
Yeah.
It's wild.
No, they want to be gods.
Yeah.
And like that, or at least demigods, live forever, control politics, control land. That's the thing that failed with the seasteading stuff that Peter Thiel and Patrick Friedman were doing, in my opinion at least, is that like you need land in order to have wealth. You can't own the water.
Yeah.
And water doesn't have the same rights to it as land, and land is when the foundational premises of properties, when the foundational premises around.
That's why
our
we need to
system.
decommodify land, decommodify housing before, like that is top priority.
And I think when you have people like Michael Moritz, who's very invested in the network state, as one of the biggest investors behind California Forever, he also understands the network state vis-a-vis its relationship to media, like pushing forward media that is run by people in his network, like the Standard. He understands that in relationship to social media, which is part of why Musk bought Twitter, was because of he was being influenced by the network state. It's also part of what Gary Tan talked about when in creating GrowSF, was that it was like a network state, a network state ideology behind the AstroTurf network, and him being kind of this Pied Piper that's kind of brought together these conservative forces with the, because the hardcore conservative forces with the like YIMBY forces or otherwise to create this AstroTurf movement that we see. And he's using the network state as a guiding principle. Yeah. So they're all like in this interest of being like, we're going to do our own thing independent from the government, anarchistic in many ways, but techno-anarchistic, anarcho-capitalist, techno-capitalistic. It's like we're bringing together the forces that they believe that they need to use in order to escape from the state and create something in their vision that more directly serves their interests, and use the state apparatus to make that possible. So, and it outlines it, read the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. They really lay that shit out pretty clearly. And it's like, oh, okay, like I get it. This makes a lot of sense of what they're trying to work towards here.
Right. Yeah, as much as it seems like SimCity 2000-ish, they have a plan.
Hello everyone, co-producer and editor Tofu here. This episode is sponsored by people like you, our community. Thank you to our patrons for supporting this two-person project. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/San Francisco. Our patrons get early access to episodes and exclusive behind-the-scenes content. Toshio and I just recorded behind-the-scenes episode 3, where I show you all in detail the editing process I do every week to produce the show. If you're interested in creating your own audio or video project, then hopefully this will help. Other than that, you can follow all of our socials, links in the description/show notes. Also, you can support our guest Jeremy. Links to support their work are also in the description. That's it for me, and now back to the episode.
Let's go back to the names the vagaries of these names.
Yep.
So the names of these organizations tend to be extremely vague. Don't know kind of what their politics are based on looking at them. The names are almost anti-political in nature. And is that like on purpose?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's part of their branding as being what in France they consider the radical center. They've made a term for that, the radical center, in order to identify people like Macron, for France, or here, the moderates are really and you've seen it in the news media and how they talk about themselves and how they branded themselves as being very distinctly their own distinct lane that I would say is really defined by being anti-progressive. Their rallying cry is basically that progressives are ruining the city, to push back against progressive candidates, to push back against progressive issues, and to do so from a place of being moderates. Well, right. And I think what's tricky about that is that there's nothing that actually defines what moderate is, if not as an antithesis to progressive,
right?
While still claiming to be not Republican and not right wing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this idea of like being common sense, I think, comes to mind. And like, who doesn't want to be that? Talking about like the anti-politics vibe of it all, like it feels like it is a thing that people are reacting against, like toxic politics. I think they even do some propaganda around like, toxic politics in SF are the reason that we exist and why we have to change. Meanwhile, like giving no sense of like what politics they're coming from and like also what kind of proposed solutions to what end they are looking to push people. So yeah, like, of course, we're going to react against the toxicity of like modern politics, the toxicity of like Trump. I think is something that they rely a lot on. The toxicity even of like Fox News is something that you have local politicians like Scott Wiener. Anytime he's on Fox News is a win for him. Like he is lighting up Twitter to show like, look, I know nobody here locally. Well, that's not true because Trump actually raised as much money as Harris at recent big SF
the David
fundraisers.
Sachs and the big fundraiser
So I was going to say that like, Trump doesn't have that much support and his campaign doesn't vibe with most people in SF. That's not completely true. Right. However, like to the majority of people here, his campaign is toxic. Fox News is not the first source of news that a lot of people are necessarily turning to. And so to place yourself in opposition to those things is a positive thing. And that's something that they have sort of successfully done.
Well, and to say more so the fact that like Trump was to a lot of people in San Francisco shockingly popular amongst venture capitalists, tech elites, like the billionaire class,
right? That
both have seen Kamala Harris's agenda, tax plan, what have you, as being, and also, regulatory agenda, generally speaking, as being too, not just too harsh, but actually from this Mark Andreessen techno-optimist perspective, they're like, they want no regulation whatsoever over the tech industry. And this isn't to say all elite billionaire venture capitalists, but the huge amount that showed up in support of Trump helped fund a good chunk of his campaign. I mean, from people like Elon Musk to Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz. Who else am I thinking of?
There's so many.
There's so many, but there's the two other partners with Michael Moritz at Sequoia Capital. I'm blanking on their names right now, but not Michael Moritz because he's been pretty big on Kamala, but his two other partners at Sequoia Capital, which is the biggest, if not the biggest, it's one of the biggest
venture capital firms,
capital banks in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And so those guys are the ones that are really excited about Trump because they're so anti-tax, they're so anti-regulation, and they see Trump as being a great vehicle to help continue to propel that forward. So, but with that being said, San Francisco, there's no risk of a Republican mayor winning, San Francisco's mayoral seat. There's no risk of a Republican running for supervisor. Even in the most conservative districts of San Francisco, there's not really much risk of a Republican really getting those supervisor seats.
Right.
So what you've been able to see instead play out is a left and right that just exists within a Democrat spectrum, but where the right is pretty indistinct, like the right, which is calling themselves moderate, on many issues is completely indistinguishable from a Republican platform.
Yeah.
But just being able to create a lane for themselves in contrast to progressives.
Right.
And that's what I think is problematic. And that's what you see this moderate movement really be able to coalesce around to say, hey, we're going to bring together I forget the exact number of people who voted for Trump in San Francisco last election, but it's not insignificant. It's like Allison Collins in her past episode mentioned how it was like there are more people who voted for Trump than are Black folks in San Francisco, which I think Black folks currently make up about 5 to 6% of San Francisco's population. Right. So it's like that's a significant chunk of people that will go right wing, and moderates have courted that vote as part of their winning strategy to ascend in San Francisco politics.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I do think about like, an easy way to describe it is like, we have, I think, always grown up with this idea implanted, at least I have, like that the Democrat Party is the more progressive party. But like historically, like you can go back to like slavery times and look at like some of the Republican versus Democrat, like it was switched for a second there. So it's not like we don't have historical precedent for the Democrat being to the right. Mm-hmm. It's hard describing San Francisco politics. And now, like you said, 28 out of the top 30 metro areas, the Portlands and the Austins and the Seattles that are like similar, where you can't run on a Republican ticket. There's no reason you will lose. You are going to have people like that are like in San Francisco, the centrist, which is to say the conservative versus the progressive. Right.
Exactly. And they don't have to actually be in accordance to or in representation of their national party. They can kind of operate in their own worlds within just like the city dynamic.
Totally. Who's funding TogetherSF? Who's behind it?
So we have this AstroTurf network, which I really am increasingly calling these like AstroTurf juggernauts, political pressure organizations that have emerged as a reaction to progressive wins in the late 2010s. And into 2020. And these groups, and when I say these groups, I mean specifically at the top there, we have Neighbors for a Better San Francisco, TogetherSF, and GrowSF. Between the three of them, they've raised over $40 million over the last 4 years. Yeah. Mostly, the bulk of the money coming into Neighbors for a Better San Francisco kind of acts as like the behind the scenes foundation to then help, throw money towards GrowSF, towards Connected SF, towards Stop Crime SF, and other sort of smaller organizations that have popped up as well that are part of this larger AstroTurf network. And I say AstroTurf because it's opposite of grassroots, fake grassroots.
No, for sure. The idea, with that is like they're trying to like grow this movement. It's not a thing. Like you don't have all of these people asking questions on the level that like it costs $40 million, like you said, to create an organization that posits that these ideas that TogetherSF wants to put forward are so all-encompassing of the people who live here and vote here. This is like a real thing. And I think the hope with all these like astroturfing organizations is that it does turn into something real and people run with it.
And that's the thing. They're trying to like, plant the seeds from the plane. Totally. Like, exactly. Here, like, take this and run with it. And yeah, I think that Allison Collins in a previous episode of yours spoke to it pretty well in terms of just like looking at the school board elections across the country and like how there was a national strategy there, Manhattan Institute players, etc. I think from these guys, are a little homegrown AstroTurf network, the money that we're most able to identify and directly connect to a donor is money that is put into the political action committees, the PACs, that are, turning around and spending big money on specific candidates, specific referendums that are being pushed and backed by these organizations. So Neighbors for a Better San Francisco has a joint kind of C4 PAC operation that they do. They bunch those taxes together and just call it one action committee. But we can, pull funders from there. We can pull funders from GrowSF. They have 3 PACs right now: a Clear Connie PAC, a Dump Dean PAC, and there's a general GrowSF PAC. They've been spending a bunch of money over the last couple of weeks, especially to push those forward. But we know who donates to those, and those we've reported on. Yeah. Specifically just the PACs. But for the C3s or the C4s, Neighbors for Better San Francisco has a 501c3 and a 501c4. We don't know who's donating to those because they don't have to report it. Same thing goes for GrowSF. They have just a C4. We don't get to know who donates to them. TogetherSF specifically within those AstroTurf groups is the most secretive of this AstroTurf network because they only have a 501c3 and a 501c4, TogetherSF and TogetherSF Action. And so therefore, we don't get to find out who donates to them. They don't reveal it. Even though they've become like a holistic, one could say like, well-rounded political machine. I don't think of them as like a political juggernaut, like where they're organizing the people on the ground. They're training candidates. They're running candidates. They're sending literature to people's homes. They're doing a door knocking campaign. Like they're doing all the things that like on all the levels of a political machine.
Yeah, it feels like a desire for control. Like, if we build this right, then in the future, everyone's going to have to like kiss our ring if they want a chance at climbing the ladder of like local Democrat politics.
Totally. No, they want to be like somebody put this really well. I think I was talking to Giovanni Barros from Mission Local, and he was mentioning another person he'd interviewed, but the metaphor is such as like, it used to be that billionaires would pick a horse to run in the race, but now these groups have bought the casino. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, or at least they're trying to have total control over the casino. Right. So then they'll run the casino. They'll also have their horses that are running. Yeah. And you're completely going to be playing on their playing fields. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're attempting to do right now with San Francisco politics. It's not just about supporting candidates. It's actually creating candidates and then creating referendums that then becomes a two-part process of like, to get their people in office who then help implement their agendas, and then also pushing for referendums that are then able to both forward their agendas, but also like make the job of the people that they're putting in power easier. Or they can be like, more accountable just directly to those big donors. Yeah.
And Kanishka and Jesse Chang, so husband and wife team that run, in the case of TogetherSF, it's Kanishka, Jay/Jesse is Neighbors for a Better SF. Yep. And the thing that I think, if you know anything about the couple, you will know that Jesse, when he was at UCI, he admitted to raping his girlfriend. And like, it's in a couple of emails that came out, and yet refused to, like have any kind of accountability process around that, to the point where like, I think it's like over a decade later, like she's still hoping for accountability. This was like back in the news, I want to say in the spring. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of like newcomers to the city who have like risen up pretty quickly, like clearly interested in having like a sort of local political consultancy empire, I would say, which is about control. And like people will have to purchase that control. And currently it's these people from venture capital, from tech, from Chamber of Commerce, from real estate, all of the most conservative elements of SF politics.
Yeah. No, and Jay wears that particularly well, but also Kanishka. Kanishka worked for Mark Farrell when he was supervisor. He also worked for London Breed for a while. She's like kind of a political city hall insider in her career. Jay, he's been a sort of a longtime protege of Mary Jung, who we'll get to her. There's someone saying that like, he got his like first job in politics driving Ed Lee around, apparently. But then, he went on to work at the Chamber of Commerce and was the political director of the Chamber of Commerce for a number of years. And then he goes on to, Mary Jung for a while was the president of the Democratic Party, DCCC. She went on to become, the director of the San Francisco Association of Realtors, right? Which is like the corporate landlord pack, essentially. It's like they advocate for corporate real estate's interests. Yeah. And so she's like the president of that. So she's like wearing that hat. And then she hires on Jay to then become political director there. So then
Right.
they're working directly together at San Francisco Association of Realtors. And then she goes and works with William Obendorf to start Neighbors for a Better San Francisco. William Obendorf is a Republican mega donor, billionaire, who's a national charter school advocate. And also a big landlord as well. So she works with him to start Neighbors for a Better San Francisco.
So we do know.
And then she jumps back to San Francisco Association of Realtors and puts Jay there in charge to continue to run the ship there.
And when you say, yeah, Oberndorf, like we know, like this is straight up. There's no doubt about it. This is like money coming from like MAGA Republican donors.
Yeah, I mean, he's like flirts with like MAGA specifically, you know, kind of like he won't donate directly to Trump, but then he will throw a bunch of money to Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and he'll like throw a bunch of money to like support the Ohio like senatorial races, which like is money that then turns around and supported like JD Vance, you know.
That's
and,
wild.
like,
Yeah.
So he kind of like keeps like an arm away from like a lot of the like hardcore MAGA people, but then will support the House, the House fund or the Senate fund for like Mississippi or for Pennsylvania.
It's so wild that, yeah, like he is literally like trying to have his finger in like the pies like everywhere.
Yeah,
like
totally.
these places are not his own hometowns.
He lives in Mill Valley. Yeah.
He has an interest in like saying that his politics, which is to say like the politics of billionaires, of people who want to concentrate wealth among very few people.
You were asking about funding though with TogetherSF.
Yes.
Which I feel like it's a good thing to try to put a wrap on, which is to say that like TogetherSF, so like because they only operate as a C3 and a C4, we don't really know who funds them, and they keep it very secret, even though they've been really acting in many ways like a PAC, especially their C4 has been acting like a political action committee. So one could make a good argument that like they should have to reveal their donors because they are running candidates and like, you know, created Mark Farrell's campaign and, you know, and Mission Local report that they are guiding the ship of the Farrell campaign. So that being said, the first time that we really got an instance into the money that they were receiving was when we had these leaked documents that we were able to bring to Mission Local, internal fundraising documents that laid out how TogetherSF had received $17 million in pledge donations from billionaire Michael Moritz. We'd already known he was the big donor behind them, but didn't know the exact amount because they never had a report on it. So yeah, but $17 million is how much he has pledged through, I believe, the 2026 election. And then it's kind of between him and his Crankstart Foundation, which is the biggest foundation in San Francisco.
The most visible thing connected to Moritz, I think, is SF Standard, which was started like 3 years ago.
Yep.
And immediately after it launched, like the thing had good search engine optimizations. It was the first thing that was going to come up on Google if you were looking for local news. It looks like fairly slick. And it has real reporters that were coming from other places like the Bay Guardian and SF Weekly. And now I think a lot of people do go to it for their local news. Yeah. And so, yeah, Moritz, this venture capitalist, is the one behind that.
Right.
And they might like print like good story from time to time, like, but I feel like that's just kind of like almost like a side effect of like the point of the thing, which is just like with Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, it is for Moritz to have like his say on whatever's happening locally.
Yeah. SF Standard came out of TogetherSF. So Hearsay Media,
Gotcha.
which is, I believe it was his own media organization that was then purchased by Moritz and TogetherSF. And at first, Kanishka Chang was the director of Hearsay Media, which then became SF Standard. And they originally had it as a nonprofit. When they started the Standard, they had it as like an independent, 501c3, and they've eventually moved that into being its own LLC, a for-profit venture. They still share an office, TogetherSF and SF Standard. And Griffin Gaffney, who is formerly the CEO of TogetherSF before Kanishka moved into that role. He's moved from TogetherSF to being the CEO of the Standard. So you could have a lot of great writers and, people like Joe Fitzrodriguez, who's had been with the big Guardian and KQED and the Examiner, and writers people I really do respect, but that their CEO was also the CEO of TogetherSF,
Right.
and they're sharing an office, and they're both owned by the same person.
Right. Same building.
It's pulling from, it's really giving, like San Francisco, like Hearst's DeYoungs, like billionaires that really run the city, who then use the media to like push forward their interests and agendas, who ran the Examiner and the Chronicle.
Right, the DeYoungs. It's actually like two brothers back in the day.
Yeah, the DeYoung brothers.
Like one was on the Chronicle, one was on, like super interesting history there that is in this book, Imperial San Francisco, that people should check out. The DeYoung Museum that people will have heard of, is part of that legacy. But yeah, I mean, it, like very much like that was the time, like people like this term yellow journalism came out of that, which is to say like journalism with a very specific point of view and a very specific intention behind it, which is to convince people of that certain point of view.
Right. Exactly. And that's what we're kind of worried about. That's what we're kind of like on edge a little bit for because I think that you've made a really good point about how a lot of people have been fed up with mainstream media, with, only a handful of companies own all of the media organizations around the United States. And that's a problem. And a lot of people have lost trust in it. And for very, very good reason. The positive that's emerged has been independent media, which I'd say San Francisco is a great example of. I watch Democracy Now! Every morning, that's a great example of Amy Goodman. And at the same time, you also have the mirror images, the tethers, with Pirate Wire, with Marina Times, Voice of San Francisco, with these organizations that have set up, and even like, the way that Elon Musk talked about taking over Twitter and turning it into X. Like these independent, right-wing, very agendized mirror images of the kind of left independent media. Right. And those are really scary because they're able to push forward narratives that are deeply reactionary. And sometimes, like I think the Standard's done a much better job, or has very intentionally tried to make sure that like it seems like a very legit, competitor with like the Chronicle or the Examiner or other more established San Francisco newspapers. However, the fact of being owned by Moritz and also having the CEO being Griffin Gaffney and having this connection with TogetherSF, you need to, as a consumer, be very wary of and aware that they are probably going to be pushing a narrative, and a narrative that aligns with this larger AstroTurf, messaging and an agenda that Moritz is deeply invested in.
Yeah, just like in the same way that you will never want to go to the Washington Post to get the latest information about Amazon. And how they're disrupting, I don't know, like people's privacy or what have you. You're not going to learn about Michael Moritz's plans for the city through the SF Standard.
Right. But what you will see is really good journalism on his opponents.
Sure.
And so you have this article that came out, looking into Dreamkeeper's initiative, looking into, the drama that emerged around the Human Rights Commission and London Breed. And it's like absolutely a story. Don't get me wrong. Like very much like there is a corruption story deep in there with Cheryl Davis, Director of Human Rights Commission, and her relationship with, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but Jim Spagnola. I've only been reading it. I haven't said it. But like you have this relationship, and the Standard was able to dig deep and find this story and bring it up.
Sure. Which
does a lot of damage, to London Breed.
Sure.
Is it a coincidence that also London Breed is running against Mark Farrell and Mark Farrell's TogetherSF's candidate?
Right.
I think you can't say that's a coincidence.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that they're not doing any hit pieces on Mark Farrell as well, because they do some hit pieces too. But when you see this kind of way that media is able to be weaponized and used to both say, hey, like what we're not going to talk about stays out of public eye, and what we are going to focus on then becomes the big public issue.
Yeah.
The zeitgeist thing. And that's how media, that's why media is so important.
And that's why, I think, again, like you have fewer and fewer people trusting these news sources that posit themselves as objective, as like truth tellers without revealing. Like, I feel like these places need to, from time to time, remind people like, oh, the Chronicle is owned by the Hearst family, which has a huge like commercial real estate empire here in San Francisco.
Yep.
So of course they're going to push things that don't get in the way of that commercial real estate empire.
Totally. And a question of like what's conspiracy, what's real,
Right.
what's news, what's fit the print,
Right.
and what's just like, that's it's hearsay,
Sure.
and a non-story.
Yeah. And I mean, something that does seem like conspiracy is Balaji Srinivasan's The Network State.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Network state, yeah. Network state's super important as a overall guiding like principle that helps make clear a lot of different actions being taken by this kind of right-wing venture capitalist Silicon Valley class. So I wanted to definitely do a shout out to Gil Duran and his reporting to bring a lot of this to light with the New Republic and also his own publication online, the Nerdreich. But essentially, you got this Coinbase cryptocurrency billionaire who's also a venture capitalist. These guys are all venture capitalists. Balaji Srinivasan. He is very close with ideologues like this person, Curtis Yarvin, who has this whole, he's basically like an anti-democracy activist. He's a pro-monarchist, likes monarchy, likes, thinks that we need to have a more corporate setup for government, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And, it has this whole dark enlightenment thing. That's a whole other podcast episode, but definitely people should check out what that's about, dark enlightenment. But he's in bed with Balaji Srinivasan, Mark Andreessen, and Ben Horowitz. Andreessen Horowitz, which is like one of the biggest venture capitalist firms in Silicon Valley. Mark Andreessen wrote the Techno-Optimist Manifesto a couple of years ago that you might have read.
Like, I mean, if people want to check this out, it is wild. It is like this as sort of like a Bible-like text. I mean, a manifesto about the future and about how like tech CEOs are going to lead us all into some utopian version that, as people can imagine, is like terrifying to like 99% of us. There should be terrified because it is all about like a caste system, like a very like class system where a few like smart tech guys run
technocrats,
the rest of us.
Right. Yeah, technocracies, technocratic regimes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And abundance, throw around the word abundance. How many times we hear the word abundance?
Right.
Abundance being a framework for unbridled capitalism.
Right.
If you just let capitalism go wild, neoliberalism 2.0 in some ways, like let capitalism go wild and pull off all the regulations, reduce all the taxes, it will just create massive abundance for all humanity and we'll all benefit from it.
Yeah.
In some, fucked up way. So, they've been pushing that forward, which honestly, I think that the moderate camp, you see a lot of overlap with the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. And you see a lot of like that, the wording from the Techno-Optimist Manifesto popping up for the guiding principles for a number of these sort of moderate, especially like more YIMBY aligned groups, but especially the neoliberal ideologies. There's actually a new group, Bay Area Neoliberal, that's started that is very explicitly running with this, like proudly owning that label.
Yeah.
So you've got those guys, you've got Elon Musk. This goes over, you saw Elon Musk at the Trump rally wearing his Occupy Mars shirts, very buddy with Andreessen Horowitz. All these people are big Trump supporters as well. I can't speak on Srinivasan, but Horowitz and Andreessen are absolutely. And then Peter Thiel, who's a big backer behind JD Vance, gave JD Vance his first job as in venture capital in San Francisco. And I think those are like interconnected as well. There is Y Combinator and Gary Tan.
Yeah. And I mean, when I think about like the end game, I do think like Hayes Valley in the middle of San Francisco, it's been proposed by people like Balaji that we gate it off and we have a class system. Like he splits it up into like the blues, the reds, and the grays. It is so, I don't know if you played like video games as a kid, but it feels like so like Civilization or SimCity 2000. Like totally. Even like the aesthetic of like the like propaganda around it looks, it's giving like, early or late 90s kind of. Same with like the Reboot conference that happened in September that Gary Tan was a keynote on
organizer.
That. The Heritage Foundation's head was also a keynote on. Heritage Foundation.
Special surprise guest.
Yes. Yeah. Heritage Foundation being, of course, like the think tank behind the Project 2025, which we talked about with Ali Collins, that is kind of like, it's become like a keyword in this election cycle. When I think of like historical examples of like what they're envisioning, like with the free market stuff, I'm like Milton Friedman, like Pinochet in Chile, and like, disappearances of people who were, like identified with like a more socialist point of view. I also think about...
and no mistake that Patrick Friedman, Milton Friedman's grandson, is also a very player here.
I didn't know that.
And the Seasiding Institutes.
I mean, I think also about like McCarthyism, like Lavender Scare, like some of these like other moments in time where it's like people going in and replacing everyone who is working at every level of government with somebody that is in the pocket of these tech CEOs. And
it's not actually even that far-fetched. It's relatively unoriginal. I mean, I mentioned already like the role that like the Hearsts and the DeYoungs have played, like, being both like today's billionaires in the power that they held in places like San Francisco and buying the media and then like implementing their agendas. But, you also have the resurgence right now of company towns. And that's basically what we have with these network state idea is to basically recreate like a company town. It's going to be like tech run, tech oriented, tech workers.
People can listen to the episode with Anna Kirsch about the California Forever, which was the planned community that would be, I mean, like you have people that are tech millionaires, billionaires living in this planned community, and then the underclass that lives around that serves them.
And serving right there in between Silicon Valley, the South, and Sacramento in the East, to be kind of like this hub right between there. Absolutely. And I think Teddy Scheffler is his last name. New York Times wrote a great piece on Prospera in Honduras, which is another example. This is a city, for-profit city that was pushed forward by the same Network State Institute that Srinivasan is behind, as well as these other players that we just mentioned, the Horowitzes and Andreessens, et cetera, that are all big funders behind this, and setting up these little network states around the world. But they did it in Honduras, and they have this island, Prospera, it's an illegal, the country of Honduras does not recognize it as an independent entity, but they recognize themselves as a CEO-run for-profit city that has its completely own regulations, does not, follow any, has its own, like he's using cryptocurrency as its currency. And people like Patrick Friedman, Milton Friedman's grandson, also, you can't make this up, Reagan's grandkids as well, have been collaborating, also supporting this project. Patsy Friedman went there more recently to get a Tesla chip implanted into his hand, which, because doctors can do that there because there's no health regulation. And they're really into also like this, like never dying is a big thing. Right. Too.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what Peter Thiel was trying to do with seasetting up here, which was like building,
which is Patrick Friedman also.
Right. Part of the seasetting, like movement that has since died. It's the idea was to like build a like freestanding like on the ocean little country that like would have no regulations around business,
independent international waters.
And like the part, I mean, it is really about control. Like when I'm saying these things, I'm like, well, with the replacement of people at all levels of government, it's like, isn't that what the left is trying to do anyway? Like similarly, but of course, like the goal on the left, I think in general is more to like decentralize power to make it so that people are in control of their own lives. Self-determination. These people, I think what I just don't understand about like how their brains work is that desire for control, a desire for controlling people in Honduras and like, and with Oberndorf, like in cities across the US, because like, his hometown isn't enough. That part, yeah, I don't understand.
No, it's a good question. I mean, and I think that it's important to understand, like, yes, you mentioned, like, you know, what they're trying to do in Solano County and California Forever, which then we got rebranded as the Solano Project, and the great work, right, in that episode that you interviewed with Anna, talking about how Artists Against Billionaires push back against that and were helpful in, like, putting together, I think they're called Solano Together as a group that's like kind of collectively
Solano Unity, yeah,
coming to push back against the network state there. But to recognize as well that the network state is more than just a like trying to set up these independent states around the world that like then become these like places for like free flow capitalism, like special economic zones, but like on steroids or whatever.
Right.
Capitalists, neoliberal wet dreams or whatever.
It is like that whole thing where it's like they say they want a free market, they don't want regulations, but actually they want socialism, but for corporations. Like
in a lot of ways, yeah. But that's one part of the network state. I think what's really important to understand here is that like the network state as an ideology goes way beyond just the physical places. Also applies to creating alternative media. It also comes around to creating basically parallel systems to all of the major systems that we have, institutions that we have in our society.
You have to do something with those billions of dollars. Like, and it's like, totally. if you can make SimCity 2000 appear in real life, I guess, and be
the ones in control. And that's the thing. It's not enough to just be billionaires. You also have to be gods. You know, they also have to have ultimate control over the entire function of society.
Some of these pictures of Balaji where he's like kind of like this guru figure at these tech conferences where everyone's like kind of like meditating around him. It's wild.
Totally. I mean, you know, you've got a bunch of CEOs taking acid and being like, how do I do this? But like for a nation.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. What is Prop D?
Yeah, so Prop D is a referendum that was put together by TogetherSF. They commissioned a big study by the Rose Institute out of Claremont McKenna College that looked into quote unquote like ways to centralize San Francisco's governments and basically make it more top down in a way to consolidate it at the top and make it, in theory, you know, better, easier to run.
More efficient.
Yeah. Resembling a little bit more of a corporation, one might say.
Right.
And with the mayor as the CEO.
Right. The idea behind the system is to spread out the power. And they want to move away from that. Right.
They're like, this whole democracy, like the way this thing's set up with a bunch of commissions and supervisors and you know, checks and balances, kind of a pain. It's kind of hard to get things through.
Right. And that's why I think, like all of those checks like are important for their ends to be wiped away because ultimately what they would love is to be able to just run their candidate every election for that person to win. Or if not, they could recall whoever is in and just control, like they'd have to control fewer people. Whereas like the problem about having like more people and like for the spreading of power is that it's harder to control.
Right, exactly. So like out of that report came a number of recommendations. One of them was to cut the amount of commissions the city has and consolidate more power around the mayor. Another one of the recommendations was to get rid of, or rather, actually, the recommendation itself was to do more of like a hybrid approach of like district-based and not district-based elections. So like at-large supervisor elections with also having some district-based elections. There's a couple other recommendations in there as well, but those are kind of like, let's start with those two. The TogetherSF is then, you know, run by Kenichika Chang, moved the first one to consolidate power on the mayor, cut commissions as their first referendum that they wanted to bring to the ballot and bring to the voters. What's interesting about it, though, is that the referendum itself very explicitly says that they're going to change the city charter. And I think Ed Harrington is one of the former controllers of San Francisco. So this is like, you know, the biggest charter change we've ever seen in city history. And if you read it, it's like, you know, the 75 pages of altered charter. It's like, you know, huge amounts of sections that they're trying to cut. But all to be said that basically they're mandating that the charters be cut in half. So from 130 to 65. And then they outline as well, like, here's a few that we're going to keep. And then here's a few that we're absolutely going to get rid of. And then even within the ones that they're keeping, to make the mayor have more power over who gets appointed to those commissions, and also give them power to kick them off the commissions as well.
Right.
By doing so, giving much less power to supervisors to appoint or to have any say over the commissions as well. And also to give the mayor ultimate power over deciding heads of departments.
Right.
That's what the Prop D says. And what's kind of interesting here is that, like, Prop E, which has come out kind of in counter to Prop D, is also an evaluation on the commission structure and being like, do we actually need all these commissions? Let's do a study. But the Rose Institute report that they actually commissioned, there was no recommendation about cutting the charters in half. They never actually said, from their own study, their own data, they never said, let's cut the charters in half and then, figure out which ones to cut. They just say that there should be a commission to look over to figure out, do we need to cut these commissions or not?
Yeah.
Which is actually what Prop E is saying, which is like, yeah, there is a commission problem, but let's figure out smartly how many to cut, what are essential, what are not essential.
Shopping. So it is like both of these propositions like have the problem of like being like kind of like policy like over people's heads.
Yeah.
I think like unless like I went to like undergrad for political science. And so like, it's kind of interesting to me and just also interesting to me in that I know that we have like what they call like a strong mayor system, which is basically where the mayor has a lot of power as compared to like the power being spread out among people like in San Francisco's case, like supervisors, where the idea is it is more representative here. They want to make it less representative.
Yes, exactly. And so what we see with Prop D is a consolidation of power, and they're hoping to get their mayor, their choice, which is Mark Farrell, in to the top of top of that executive branch.
Right.
And then to proceed with like being able to essentially consolidate and hold power moving forward, and then having the next referendum cycle get rid of district-based elections and move it to citywide elections, as it lays out in the insider document. And once again, by making it citywide elections as opposed to district-based elections, you're going back to a system that San Francisco used to have before 1976, where you had all white men back then. Very quickly, once 1976 charter amendment happened and they had district-based elections, that's when people, you had our first gay supervisor, Harvey Milk, get elected. You had your first African-American supervisor in San Francisco history, Ella Hill Hutch, get elected. You had your first Asian-American supervisor in SF history, Gordon Lau, get elected. That all happened because of district-based elections. Citywide elections, like as we've seen with the mayor's race, they're incredibly expensive. It's a lot more expensive to have to knock on doors of the entire city, run ads for the entire city, as opposed to just fighting within your district.
Right. I mean, when you have money like they do, that is not an issue.
Exactly. So to move the playing field to make it more in line with pay to play. Yeah. Which is what the billionaires want. They don't have the left has the people. The right has the money, and they want to shift the system around to make it so that the money is what is the most important deciding factor in determining who gets elected.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say like that is the reason why people are turned off from voting. Yeah. The reason that people are like, democracy, what? Like, including myself, like I have these questions like why, like this experiment, the grand experiment, the American democracy, like, but the point is like the interesting thing to me is that this is really about control and like narrowing like who gets to have a say. Thank you so much for coming through to my little studio.
Yeah,
next
happy
to
to be
the Murphy
here.
bed.
Comfortable.
All right, so see you soon.
Yes.
All right.
Totally.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/Sad Francisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.